In the rolling farmland of northeastern France, a collision of steel and fire would prove that superior tactics could triumph over superior machines. The Battle of Arracourt stands as one of the largest tank engagements on the Western Front during World War II, a brutal 11-day clash where American tankers turned a German armoured counter-offensive into a catastrophic defeat. When the smoke cleared over the Lorraine countryside in late September 1944, factory-fresh Panther tanks lay shattered across the fields, while the men who destroyed them had achieved something remarkable. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams and his 37th Tank Battalion claimed 55 German tanks destroyed while losing just 14 Shermans, a kill ratio that defied every assumption about German armoured superiority. This is the story of how American training, leadership, and tactical ingenuity transformed what should have been a German victory into one of the most lopsided tank battles of the entire war. The road to Arracourt began with the spectacular Allied breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. Operation Cobra had shattered German defensive lines, and Lieutenant General George Patton's newly activated Third Army poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. Patton's tanks raced across France at a pace that stunned both the retreating Germans and Allied planners alike. The Third Army covered ground at speeds that exceeded anything seen in armoured warfare since the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. Town after town fell to the advancing Americans, their columns moving so fast that German defenders often found themselves surrounded before they knew the enemy had arrived. By early September, the Third Army had advanced nearly 400 miles from the Normandy beaches, liberating vast swaths of French territory and threatening to breach the German border itself. The speed of this advance created a logistics nightmare that would shape everything that followed. Allied supply lines stretched back to the invasion beaches, and the further Patton pushed, the more fuel his tanks consumed. Each Sherman required roughly 50 gallons of gasoline to travel 100 miles, and the 4th Armoured Division alone burned through thousands of gallons every day. The famous Red Ball Express trucking operation struggled to keep pace with the advancing armies, but there simply was not enough fuel to sustain offensives across the entire front. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower faced an impossible choice about where to allocate precious resources. The decision came down in favor of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in Holland, an ambitious airborne operation scheduled to launch on September 17th. Patton's Third Army found its fuel allocation slashed dramatically, bringing the lightning advance to a grinding halt just as it approached the German frontier. Patton was furious, believing he could have punched through the weakened German defences and ended the war by Christmas. Instead, his tanks sat idle, while supplies flowed north to support Montgomery's gamble in the Netherlands. The Third Army spearhead was the 4th Armoured Division, widely considered the finest armoured formation in the European theatre. Activated at Pine Camp, New York in April 1941, the division had spent 3 years training for the invasion of Europe. Its soldiers had developed an aggressive tactical doctrine that emphasized speed, initiative, and combined arms cooperation. Commanded by Major General John Wood, a man his troops called Tiger Jack for his relentless offensive spirit, the division had built an exceptional record during the dash across France. Wood believed that armour should never stop moving, that hesitation gave the enemy time to recover and reorganize. He demanded speed and initiative from his subordinates, and they delivered victories that exceeded anything the Army had expected from its armoured forces. At the tip of this spear was Combat Command A under Colonel Bruce Clark, a brilliant tactician who would later command forces during the Battle of the Bulge and rise to 4-star general rank. Combat Command A included the 37th Tank Battalion commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the 53rd Armoured Infantry Battalion, elements of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion equipped with M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, and the 66th and 94th Armoured Field Artillery Battalions. This was a combined arms team in the truest sense, with tanks, infantry, artillery, and tank destroyers trained to fight together as a single integrated force. Abrams was already becoming a legendary figure among American tankers. A 1936 graduate of West Point, he had risen rapidly through the ranks since the war began, demonstrating a talent for armored warfare that his superiors recognized and rewarded. He led from the front in his own Sherman tank, which he named Thunderbolt, going so far as to paint the name in large letters on the armor. He would go through 6 Thunderbolts by the end of the war, each one destroyed or damaged beyond repair in combat. His driver later recalled that during tank battles, Abrams was shooting tanks like the rest of the boys, mixing in wherever the toughest battle was. It made them feel like fighting harder when they could see a great man like Abrams alongside them. Another soldier remembered that Abrams never made things more difficult or unhappy than they were, unlike some officers of far lesser rank. His success, promotions, and honors left him unchanged and unspoiled. On September 13, 1944, the 37th Tank Battalion crossed the Moselle River and drove deep into German-held territory. Clark had asked Abrams which route they should take, pointing to a map showing 2 possible crossings. Abrams studied the map briefly then, jabbed his finger at the eastern bank. "That is the shortest way home," he said. Clark approved the order, and the tank battalion surged across the river. Once on the eastern bank, they continued their lightning advance, driving 20 miles into the German rear by nightfall. The following day, September 14th, they overran the rear command post of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division at Arracourt and caught the same division's forward headquarters at Valais before it could retreat. The German staff officers barely escaped, abandoning documents and equipment in their haste to flee the oncoming American tanks. It was at Valais on September 14th that Sergeant Joe Sadowski of Company A would earn the Medal of Honor posthumously. This non-commissioned officer from Perth Amboy, New Jersey, was commanding the 2nd tank in the column as the 37th rolled into the French town. Swinging north around a corner, Sadowski's Sherman clattered into the village square, where a German armor-piercing round found its mark and set the tank ablaze against the town's water trough. Sadowski dismounted his crew and took shelter behind a building after running a gauntlet of machine gun and small arms fire. He then organized his surviving crewmen to return fire against the German positions. When he saw one of his men lying wounded in the open, exposed to enemy fire, Sadowski ran back through the storm of bullets to rescue him. He reached the wounded tanker and was dragging him to safety when German fire cut him down. His selfless courage under fire exemplified the spirit that made the 37th Tank Battalion one of the finest units in the American Army. For 3 days, Clark's Combat Command A operated behind enemy lines, spreading confusion and terror through the German rear areas. The Americans captured supplies, established roadblocks, and ambushed retreating enemy columns. At the town of Valais, the 37th cleared 8 88mm anti-tank guns and captured 300 Germans in a single action. But their exposed position also made them dangerously vulnerable to counter-attack, and the German High Command was already planning the response that would lead to the bloodiest tank battle on the Western Front. The German High Command recognized that Patton's unrelenting pressure required an immediate and vigorous response. Adolf Hitler demanded a bold counter-offensive that would not merely stop the American advance but destroy the bridgehead over the Moselle entirely. Army Group G commander Colonel General Johannes Blaskowitz understood that his 1st and 19th armies were too weak to accomplish this mission alone. The only realistic option was to commit the newly reorganized 5th Panzer Army, and Hitler selected General Hasso von Manteuffel to command it. Manteuffel was a highly decorated officer who had proven his skill handling armored forces on the Eastern Front. He had commanded the 7th Panzer Division during Operation Barbarossa, earning the Knight's Cross for capturing a key bridge on the outskirts of Moscow in November 1941. His aggressive counterattacks in Tunisia nearly cut communications behind the Allied front, and his mobile defense in Ukraine had checked Marshal Konev's drive into Romania in May 1944. Hitler summoned Manteuffel to his headquarters at Rastenburg on September 1, 1944, and personally gave him command of the Fifth Panzer Army, with specific instructions to launch a large-scale offensive against Patton's Third Army. Manteuffel had barely 8 days to organize his forces before the attack was scheduled to begin. The forces available to Manteuffel presented a paradox that would prove fatal to German hopes. His army assembled 262 tanks and assault guns for the offensive, including 182 tanks, divided between 75 Panzer IVs and 107 of the formidable Panther tanks, supplemented by 80 self-propelled assault guns. On paper, this represented tremendous striking power that should have overwhelmed the thin American lines around Arracourt. The Panzer V Panther was widely considered the finest medium tank of the war, combining the lessons the Germans had learned, fighting Soviet T-34s, into a vehicle that balanced firepower, protection, and mobility better than any other design. Its frontal armor was 80 mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees to increase effective thickness to 140 mm and deflect incoming rounds. The long-barreled 75 mm KWK-42 gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters with ease, while the Sherman's short 75 mm cannon could not penetrate the Panther's frontal glacis even at point-blank range. American tankers who had faced Panthers in Normandy knew the only way to kill one was to hit its thinner side or rear armor, which required dangerous maneuvering under fire. But the German advantage in equipment masked a crippling weakness in personnel. The Fifth Panzer Army's tank strength came primarily from two newly formed units, the 111th Panzer Brigade and the 113th Panzer Brigade. These formations existed on paper as powerful combined arms teams, each authorized 2 battalions of tanks with 45 Panzer IVs and 45 Panthers, supported by mechanized Panzer Grenadier infantry. Reality fell far short of the establishment tables. The brigades had received the newest Panthers fresh from the factory, but their crews had only 2 weeks of training before being committed to combat. The men had not trained together as units, possessed little proficiency in tactical maneuvering, and had virtually no experience in large-scale combined arms operations. The rushed training schedules meant crews barely knew how to operate their own vehicles, let alone coordinate with other tanks in their platoon or company. Making matters worse, the Panthers still suffered from mechanical problems, and chronic fuel shortages had prevented adequate practice. The 113th Panzer Brigade had only 42 operational Panthers by the time of the attack, with the rest broken down or still in transit from the factories. The veteran 11th Panzer Division also participated in the battle, adding experienced leadership to the operation. This was the famous Ghost Division that Erwin Rommel had commanded during the campaign in France in 1940, and its crews were battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. But while the division's tankers were experienced, the unit had lost most of its vehicles in earlier fighting and could contribute only about 40 tanks and assault guns. The paradox was stark and ultimately fatal. Germany's most experienced tank crews received older Panzer IVs and worn-out equipment, while green replacements struggled to master the complex Panther in combat for the first time. Hitler's insistence on sending the newest tanks to newly formed units rather than reinforcing veteran formations would prove catastrophic. The Panzer Brigades also lacked the supporting units that made a Panzer Division such a lethal combined arms team. They had no organic reconnaissance battalions, no artillery beyond a few attached batteries, and insufficient engineers. A full Panzer Division included armoured cars for scouting, self-propelled guns for infantry support, engineers for breaching obstacles, and extensive logistics elements. The brigades had tanks and infantry, but little else. This meant they would advance blind against an enemy who knew the terrain intimately, unable to find American positions until their Panthers were already under fire. The Americans of Combat Command A faced their own challenges. The 4th Armored Division fielded approximately 163 tanks to support its 15,000 troops, mostly M4. Shermans armed with the short-barreled 75mm gun that had proven inadequate against German heavy armour in Normandy. A handful of newer Shermans mounted the longer 76mm gun that could penetrate Panther side armour at reasonable ranges, but these were in short supply. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyers of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion provided additional anti-tank capability with their 76mm guns, but their thin armour made them vulnerable to any German weapon. What the Americans lacked in individual vehicle quality, they compensated for with training, experience, and combined arms coordination. Combat Command A had been fighting continuously since the breakout from Normandy, honing their skills through 2 months of constant action. The 4th Armoured Division's tankers knew their machines intimately, understood how to coordinate with infantry and artillery, and had developed the tactical instincts that only combat experience can provide. The German plan called for a 2-pronged attack. The 111th Panzer Brigade would strike at Luneville, south of Arracourt, while the 113th Panzer Brigade advanced north of the Rhine-Marne Canal to clear the area around Arracourt itself. The two forces would link up near Bures and drive westward toward Nancy, eliminating the American bridgehead and restoring German defensive lines along the Moselle. Meanwhile, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division would support the northern attack, while elements of the German First Army applied pressure elsewhere along the front to prevent the Americans from shifting reinforcements. If everything went according to plan, Manteuffel's forces would crush Combat Command A between converging armoured pincers and roll up the entire American position. The battle opened on September 18, 1944, when the 111th Panzer Brigade attacked Luneville. The assault immediately went wrong, in ways that would characterize the entire German offensive. Poor reconnaissance and inadequate map reading sent the brigade stumbling into the town without realizing it was still contested by American forces. German tanks became entangled in vicious street fighting with elements of the 2nd Cavalry Group and Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armoured Division, suffering heavy losses in an urban environment that negated every advantage of their superior armour and firepower. A Panther was just as vulnerable to a bazooka round through its side armour in a town square as it was on an open battlefield, and American infantry knew how to exploit the tight confines of built-up areas. By day's end, the Germans had lost 24 armoured vehicles without achieving their objective. To make matters worse, a patriotic French farmer deliberately misdirected one German column along its route of march, causing critical delays that threw off the coordination between the two attacking brigades. The planned link-up between the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades at Bures did not occur until late afternoon, hours behind schedule. Generals Wood and Eddy initially believed the Luneville engagement was merely a local counterattack by disorganized German units trying to slow the American advance. They prepared to continue their own offensive toward Germany the following morning, planning a drive on Sarreguemines that would carry them across the border into the Reich itself. But reports of increased German activity throughout the night of September 18th forced them to postpone the attack. Scouts detected tracked vehicles moving through the darkness east of American positions, and artillery observers counted some 30 tanks assembling near Luneville. Something larger than a local counterattack was developing. The 5th Panzer Army, having failed to take Luneville quickly, simply bypassed the town and began moving north to strike at Combat Command A's exposed position around Arracourt. The morning of September 19th dawned with thick fog blanketing the Lorraine countryside, reducing visibility to mere yards in places. The rolling hills and farm fields disappeared beneath an impenetrable grey veil that turned the familiar terrain into a disorienting maze. For the Germans, the fog seemed like a gift from Providence. It would conceal their advance from the American fighter-bombers that had savaged their columns throughout the campaign, allowing them to close with the enemy without suffering the devastating air attacks that had destroyed so many panzers since Normandy. German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to constant harassment from above breathed easier knowing the Allied aircraft were grounded. But the same fog that protected them also blinded them to American positions and negated the superior range of their tank guns. A Panther's deadly 75mm cannon could outrange a Sherman significantly, but that advantage meant nothing when visibility dropped to 100 meters or less. At such close ranges, even the Sherman's shorter gun could penetrate Panther armor. Without integral reconnaissance units, the German brigades were forced to advance blindly against an enemy they could not see, hoping to stumble upon American positions rather than locating them through proper scouting. Combat Command A's dispositions around Arracourt consisted of a thinly held salient, using an extended outpost line of armoured infantry and engineers supported by tanks, tank destroyers and artillery. Colonel Clark had positioned his forces to take advantage of the terrain, placing observation posts on commanding hills and keeping his tank companies in reserve positions where they could respond quickly to any threat. Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion under Captain Kenneth Lamerson held an outpost near the village of Lizy, about 4 miles northeast of Arracourt, just before midnight on September 18th. Lamerson's outposts heard tracked vehicles moving in the darkness to their front. They called for artillery fire on the sound of the engines, and the clanking of treads ceased as the German column halted under the bombardment. Around 7:30 in the morning on September 19th, a liaison officer driving down the road near Bézange-la-Petite ran directly into the rear of a German tank column. The thick morning fog had hidden the panzers until his jeep was nearly among them. Miraculously, the Germans failed to notice him in the murk, and he escaped to radio his battalion commander. Colonel Abrams received the report at Lizy and immediately began positioning his forces. At about the same time, a light tank platoon had a brush with German armor in the vicinity, confirming that a major attack was developing. At 8 in the morning, company-sized elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated Combat Command A's outposts on the east and south faces of the salient. The German tanks emerged from the fog with little warning, their engines roaring as they pressed toward the American headquarters. 2 tank destroyer platoons and a medium tank company engaged the panzers in a running fight that extended into the vicinity of Combat Command A's headquarters at Arracourt itself. The situation grew desperate as German tanks approached within hundreds of yards of Clark's command post. In a remarkable display of improvisation, a battalion of M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers took the German tanks under direct fire at point-blank range. The M7 mounted a 105mm howitzer designed for indirect fire support, but at such close range its high-explosive shells proved devastating against Panther armor. The priests fired over open sights into the German formation, their crews displaying extraordinary courage as they engaged tanks with artillery pieces, never designed for such fighting. The fog that had concealed the German approach now worked decisively against them. Poor tactical deployment exposed the weaker side armor of their tanks to American Shermans that used the limited visibility as cover. Moving through positions they knew intimately, American tankers flanked the German columns and opened fire at ranges where their shorter guns could penetrate Panther armor. The Germans found themselves taking hits from multiple directions without being able to identify where the fire was coming from. 11 panzers were knocked out in this initial engagement alone, their crews dead or fleeing into the fog while their expensive vehicles burned. The fighting on September 19th demonstrated the pattern that would define the entire battle. The 113th Panzer Brigade launched multiple attacks throughout the day, but each assault followed the same disastrous script. German tanks advanced through the fog in column formation, unable to deploy into combat spreads because they could not see far enough to maintain formation. When they finally made contact with American positions, they found themselves under fire from multiple directions. Shermans appeared on their flanks while artillery shells crashed down on their formations. Tank destroyer crews waited in ambush positions, their fast and agile Hellcats racing to intercept German columns before disappearing into the murk. The Americans exploited their knowledge of the terrain to occupy concealed defensive positions on commanding ground, remaining hidden until the Germans closed to within effective range before unleashing devastating salvos. Captain Kenneth Lameson's actions that morning epitomized the American tactical approach. His observation post near Bézange-la-Petite consisted of dismounted crewmen connected to their tanks by a telephone wire, an improvised early warning system that proved invaluable. When the observation post spotted several Panthers emerging from the fog at a distance of less than 75 meters, Lameson's hidden. Shermans were waiting. One tank was positioned west of the north-south road, while another was tucked away in a barn and camouflaged under straw. The gunners opened fire, and the lead Panthers were hit before their crews even realized they were under attack. 3 German tanks were disabled in the opening volley, their crews bailing out as flames erupted from their engine compartments. When the surviving Panzers retreated south of the highway, Lameson recognized an opportunity to turn the withdrawal into a rout. The speed advantage of the Sherman tank afforded Lameson a critical edge. Though the Panther was theoretically faster, its transmission was temperamental and its crews inexperienced, while the Sherman's reliable powertrain had been perfected through 3 years of production and combat experience. Lameson raced his faster Shermans along a ridgeline paralleling the German retreat, reaching an attack position west of Bézange 3 minutes before the slow-moving Panther column passed through the village. From his elevated position, Lameson's tank crews had perfect flank shots on the enemy column, while the ridge crest provided natural cover for the lower-profile Shermans. The ambush was devastating. With their weaker side armor exposed and their turrets unable to traverse quickly enough to engage the threat, the Panthers did not stand a chance. One by one, the German tanks exploded under accurate American fire. Crews who survived the initial hits found themselves trapped in burning vehicles or cut down by machine gun fire as they tried to escape. The turret traverse advantage proved crucial throughout the battle. The Sherman's turret was powered by a more responsive hydraulic system that allowed American gunners to acquire and engage targets significantly faster than their German counterparts. In the confused close-range fighting that characterized Arracourt, this split-second advantage often meant the difference between life and death. German tankers found themselves taking hits before they could bring their superior guns to bear, dying beside cannons that could have killed their opponents if only they had been given a few more seconds to aim. By late afternoon on September 19th, Company A of the 37th Tank Battalion returned from Luneville, where it had been detached to task force hunter the previous day. Clark and Abrams immediately paired Company A with Company B. Dust off the sights, wipe off the shot, and breeze right through, they instructed the company commanders. The 2 tank units swept across the zone east of Arracourt, hunting down any German vehicles that remained in the area. Major William Hunter formed up southwest of Recipient with 24 Shermans and a platoon of Hellcats from Lieutenant Dwight's tank destroyer company. Within minutes, the American tankers were hitting the remaining enemy armor from front and flank simultaneously, resulting in 8 more German tanks knocked out and approximately 100% German infantry casualties. The Americans lost 3 tanks in this final engagement of the day. By nightfall on September 19th, the situation looked catastrophic for the Fifth Panzer Army. Combat Commander reported destroying 43 enemy tanks, mostly factory new Panthers, while suffering only 5 Shermans and 3 Hellcats knocked out. American casualties amounted to just 6 men killed and 3 wounded. General Patton himself visited Arracourt that evening, conferring with General Wood and Colonel Clark about the situation. The consensus was that the German counterattack had failed, and that the offensive toward Germany should continue the following morning. There seemed little reason to worry about a threat that had been so thoroughly beaten, but Mount Eiffel was not finished. Under intense pressure from Army Group G Commander Blaskowitz to continue the offensive regardless of losses, he ordered his battered brigades to resume attacking at dawn. Blaskowitz delivered a sharp reprimand when Manteuffel suggested abandoning the operation, accusing him of lacking the offensive spirit and insisting that the drive toward Nancy must continue. On September 20th, the 111th Panzer Brigade entered the fight around Arracourt, combining with the remnants of the 113th Brigade for another attempt to break through American lines. The morning again brought thick fog, and German Panther tanks pushed toward the headquarters of Combat Command A. Several 4th Armoured Division support units were pinned down or trapped by the German advance, including a waterpoint crew that found itself surrounded by enemy armour. It was during this crisis that Major Charles Carpenter earned his legendary nickname and place in aviation history. Carpenter commanded the 4th Armoured Division's reconnaissance aircraft detachment, flying a tiny Piper L-4 Grasshopper observation plane that he had modified with bazookas mounted under the wings. He called his aircraft Rosie the Rocketer. The L-4 was a fragile machine never designed for combat, a fabric-covered liaison plane with a top speed barely exceeding 80 miles per hour. Carpenter had reasoned that if he could carry bazookas into the air, he could attack enemy tanks without the lengthy process of calling in regular fighter bombers. When the fog lifted around noon on September 20th, Carpenter spotted a company of German Panther tanks advancing toward Arracourt. Diving through a barrage of German ground fire that would have deterred most pilots in far more robust aircraft, Carpenter attacked the enemy formation in repeated passes. His first sortie fired all of his bazooka rockets at the tanks below, forcing the German commanders to button up inside their vehicles and disrupting their advance. Returning to a nearby airstrip to reload, he flew 2 more sorties that afternoon, firing no fewer than 16 rockets at German tanks and armoured cars. Ground troops later verified that Bazooka Charlie had knocked out 2 Panther tanks and several armoured cars, while killing or wounding a dozen enemy soldiers. More importantly, his audacious attacks forced the German tank formation to retreat to its starting position, enabling the trapped American waterpoint crew to escape capture and destruction. Carpenter would eventually be credited with destroying 6 enemy tanks during the Lorraine campaign, an achievement that earned him multiple decorations and a lasting place in American military folklore. Also on September 20th, Captain Lamesson's Company C encountered elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade Reserve in heavy fighting. Lamesson lost 5 or 6 tanks in the exchange, the heaviest casualties his company had suffered during the entire battle. But he inflicted approximately the same number of tank casualties on the enemy before withdrawing to allow Abrams to maneuver Company B against the remaining German forces. The fluid tactics that characterized American armor operations stood in stark contrast to the rigid German approach. Where Manteuffel's brigades repeatedly attacked the same positions using the same routes, Abrams constantly shifted his forces to exploit weaknesses and create new threats that the Germans could not anticipate. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams demonstrated his own brand of aggressive leadership on September 20th, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. When 2 of his tank companies were outflanked and seriously disorganized by a German armored attack of superior forces, Abrams quickly and accurately estimated the situation. Rather than pulling back to reorganize, he unhesitatingly attacked the enemy force with his command tank. Striking with such ferocity that the enemy was thrown into a state of confusion, he bought precious time for his scattered forces to regroup. Abrams then daringly led his reorganized companies in a frontal assault that resulted in the complete rout of the enemy and the capture of a valuable position with a considerable amount of enemy supplies. The citation noted that his rapid and heroic action, undertaken with great initiative and brilliant leadership, was largely responsible for the successful outcome of the engagement. His driver remembered that Abrams was always alongside his men in the toughest fighting, and it made everyone want to fight harder knowing their commander shared their danger. The pattern of German failure continued through September 21st, though the cost to American forces began to mount as the fighting intensified. That morning, the commander of the 113th Panzer Brigade, Colonel Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf, was killed in action, a devastating blow to a unit already reeling from 3 days of heavy losses. German command and control, already poor due to inexperienced staffs and inadequate communications, deteriorated further without his leadership. But the weather finally began to clear on September 21st, and this proved catastrophic for the German forces still struggling to break through American lines. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group from the 19th Tactical Air Command were able to begin relentless attacks on German ground formations as the fog lifted. The relationship between the 4th Armored Division and the 19th Tactical Air Command represented a model of air-ground cooperation that the Germans simply could not match. Air liaison officers riding in tanks equipped with VHF radios could communicate directly with aircraft overhead, pointing out enemy concentrations for immediate attack. Tank crews marked targets with colored smoke grenades, and divisional artillery sometimes added smoke shell bombardments to highlight German positions. Within as little as 3 minutes of contact, Thunderbolts could be diving on the designated target, their .850 caliber machine guns and 500-pound bombs tearing into enemy formations. The effect of American air power was devastating beyond anything the Germans had experienced since Normandy. P-47s ranged ahead of friendly tanks, attacking any German movement they spotted. When Panthers tried to mass for another attack, Thunderbolts caught them in the open and left them burning. Fuel and ammunition trucks exploded under strafing runs, leaving panzer units stranded and unable to continue operations. When the Luftwaffe attempted to provide cover for their ground forces, they found themselves overwhelmed by American fighters that enjoyed both numerical superiority and better-trained pilots. German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to operating with air superiority on the Eastern Front found the skies above Lorraine to be a killing zone where any vehicle caught in the open was almost certain to be destroyed. On September 22nd, the 11th Panzer Division joined the offensive, combining with the mauled remnants of the 2 Panzer Brigades for one more desperate attempt to break through at Arracourt. In the pre-dawn darkness, the veteran division began its mission to seal off the 4th Armoured's penetration by gaining control of the area west of Bézange and the Arracourt Blois de Benamont. The experienced German crews were more tactically proficient than the Green Brigades that had been slaughtered over the previous days, but they faced Americans who had now repelled multiple attacks and knew exactly where the Germans would come. Abrams coordinated his defense brilliantly, combining direct fire from his tanks with indirect artillery support from Combat Command A's field artillery battalions and air strikes from the 19th Tactical Air Command. The triple threat of tanks, artillery, and aircraft proved overwhelming even for veteran German tankers. By the end of September 22nd, the 113th Panzer Brigade had effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. The 111th Panzer Brigade was little better off. German records noted grimly that only a handful of men remained from units that had begun the offensive with thousands of soldiers and scores of tanks. The 4-day tank battle from September 19th through September 22nd had cost Combat Command a 14 M4 Sherman medium tanks and 7 M5 light tanks totally destroyed, with 25 men killed and 88 wounded. German losses could not be accurately determined in the chaos of the fighting, but the 4th Armoured Division would eventually claim 281 German tanks destroyed during the entire Lorraine campaign, along with 3,000 Germans killed and 3,000 taken prisoner. The fighting around Arracourt continued through September 29th, but the character of the battle had fundamentally changed. The Fifth Panzer Army fed the remnants of its shattered brigades and the understrength 11th Panzer Division into a series of disjointed attacks that accomplished nothing except adding to the German casualty lists. On September 24th, most of the fighting shifted to the village of Château Salins, where a fierce attack by the 559th Volksgrenadier Division of the German First Army nearly overwhelmed Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division. American infantry fought desperately to hold their positions as German Panzer Grenadiers pressed forward through intense fire. The crisis lasted until P-47 Thunderbolts arrived overhead and routed the attacking Germans with devastating strafing runs, breaking the assault when victory seemed within German grasp. The following day, September 25th, Third Army received orders from higher headquarters to suspend all offensive operations and consolidate its gains. The fuel shortage that had halted Patton's advance in early September persisted, and there was no prospect of resuming the drive toward Germany until supply lines could be established. On September 26th, the entire 4th Armored Division reverted to a defensive posture. Combat Command withdrew 5 miles to more defensible ground, while Combat Command B, relieved at Château Salins by the 35th Infantry Division, linked up with its right flank. The 37th Tank Battalion took up positions around the village of Juvelais, covering the maximum amount of battle space possible while remaining responsive to Combat Command A's needs. The 5th Panzer Army, reduced to only 25 operational tanks from the 262 it had possessed at the start of the offensive, pressed its attacks unsuccessfully for 3 more days. German infantry launched probing attacks against American positions on September 27th, only to be repelled by concentrated artillery fire from 6 battalions of guns that Abrams had coordinated for the defense. When clearing weather on September 29th brought increased American air activity, the Germans finally suspended their counter-offensive altogether and began retreating toward the German frontier. Of the 262 armoured fighting vehicles the Germans had deployed at Arracourt, only 62 remained operational when the battle ended. The 37th Tank Battalion's achievement at Arracourt defied everything that conventional wisdom said about tank warfare on the Western Front. Abrams and his men claimed 55 German tanks destroyed while losing only 14 Shermans, a kill ratio of nearly 4-to-1 against machines that were supposed to be vastly superior in every respect. The battalion motto was "Courage Conquers," and the men of the 37th had proven that courage combined with superior skill could overcome even the most formidable enemy equipment. Several factors combined to produce this remarkable outcome that military analysts have studied ever since. The fog that blanketed the battlefield during the critical early fighting negated the range advantage of German tank guns, forcing engagements at distances where the Sherman's shorter weapon could penetrate Panther armor. The inexperience of German crews meant they committed basic tactical errors that veteran tankers would have avoided, such as advancing in column without reconnaissance, exposing their flanks to concealed American positions, and failing to coordinate their attacks. The lack of integral scouting units in the panzer brigades left German commanders completely blind to American dispositions until their Panthers were already under fire. American mastery of combined arms tactics allowed infantry, artillery, tank destroyers, and aircraft to support the Sherman crews in ways that multiplied their effectiveness enormously, and the aggressive leadership of officers like Abrams, Clark, and Wood ensured that American forces seized every opportunity to outmaneuver and destroy their opponents rather than simply reacting to German moves. The battle also highlighted the crucial importance of training and unit cohesion that no amount of superior equipment could replace. The 4th Armored Division had been fighting together since the breakout from Normandy, developing the instinctive coordination that only comes from shared experience under fire. Crews knew their tanks, knew their fellow tankers, and knew their officers. The German panzer brigades, by contrast, were ad hoc formations thrown together in desperate haste, their crews barely knowing their own vehicles, let alone their fellow soldiers. Hitler's decision to send the newest tanks to the newest units rather than reinforcing veteran formations proved catastrophic, wasting some of Germany's best equipment on crews who lacked the skill to use it effectively. Arracourt demonstrated that technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory in armoured warfare. The Panther was unquestionably a better tank than the Sherman in terms of armour protection and firepower. In a purely theoretical one-on-one engagement, on open ground at long range, the Panther should have destroyed any Sherman it faced. But tanks do not fight in theoretical vacuums. They operate as part of combined arms teams that include infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft. They depend on reconnaissance to find the enemy and logistics to keep them supplied with fuel and ammunition. They require trained crews who understand their vehicles and commanders who know how to employ them effectively. The Germans had better tanks, but the Americans had better tankers and a better system for employing them. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams went on to become one of the most celebrated American military leaders of the 20th century. 3 months after Arracourt, he led the 37th Tank Battalion in the dramatic relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. When the 101st Airborne Division found itself surrounded by German forces during the Ardennes offensive, Abrams' battalion spearheaded the breakthrough that reached the beleaguered paratroopers on the day after Christmas 1944. "We are going in to those people now," Abrams said, as he ordered the final assault. A war correspondent who witnessed the relief described him as already a legendary figure in this war. Abrams eventually rose to become commander of all American forces in Vietnam and then Army Chief of Staff, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Army. The main battle tank that replaced the Sherman in American service bears his name to this day, a fitting tribute to the man who proved that American tankers could defeat any enemy regardless of their equipment. The Battle of Arracourt demonstrated that victory in armoured warfare belongs not to those with the best machines, but to those who best combine technology with training, leadership with logistics, and courage with tactical skill. The Panthers that littered the Lorraine countryside in September 1944 stand as permanent testament to that enduring truth.